Hi, everybody. It's Professor Mitchell. We're continuing with Chapter 5 on decimals, and today we're going to be talking about adding and subtracting decimals. Adding and subtracting decimals is super easy as long as you've got a good handle on adding and subtracting integers. Some of these decimals will be negative, so when we get to the ones involving negative numbers, we will review the rules for adding positives and negatives, two negatives. Okay, so objectives in this section, we're adding and subtracting decimals, estimating to determine if the answers are reasonable, evaluate expressions with decimal replacement values, simplify expressions containing decimals, and then finally a little bit of problem solving. All right, so to add or subtract decimals, all you have to do is write the decimals so that the decimal points all line up. And then just add or subtract them the same way you would with whole numbers. And then place the decimal points so that in the answer so that it also lines up with the decimal points in the numbers in the problem. And remember that you can add zeros onto the end of a decimal, and that will help you line them up. So for example, if you were doing 85 minus 13 and 26 hundredths, you would write that like this. Okay. All right, so here are those steps with an example shown off to the side. First, write the decimals so that the decimal points line up vertically. You can see how they've done that here with 4 thousandths and 85 thousandths. Then we're going to add the way we would normally add 4 plus 85. Okay. Just add all the way going down. Notice that they haven't inserted the decimal point here yet. But now we're going to go ahead and place that decimal point so that it lines up with the other decimal points in the problem. All right, so our first example, we're adding 756 and 23 hundredths, 26 and 504 thousandths, and 1 and 87 thousandths. Notice the 0 inserted at the end of 756 and 23 hundredths. That helps me line them up. You don't really have to do that as long as you are sure to line up the decimal points. Okay, that's really, really important. And I think for a lot of people, it does help to put that 0 in there. Okay. So we're not going to show much of our work with actually adding those together. It works just the same way as if those decimal points weren't there. Okay. 4 plus 7 is 11. I would carry the 1. 1 and 3 is 4. 8 is 12. So then I would carry a 1 up here. 1 and 2 is 3. 5 is 8. Don't have to carry anything now. 6 and 6 is 12. 1 is 13. Carry the 1. 1 and 5 is 6. 2 is 8. And then just bring down the 7. So the final answer is 783 and 821 thousandths. So remember, you can pause this video anytime you're feeling confident and you want to try one of these before we go over it. So feel free to do that at any time. We will go ahead and write this as 19 and no thousandths. Insert 3 zeros so that it has the same number of decimal places as the other number. And then we'll go ahead and add these together. You end up with 45 and 72 thousandths. All right, now we're throwing a negative number into the mix. So my students will hopefully recall that whenever we added a positive and a negative, we said ignore the signs, turn that into a subtraction. Okay. So I'm going to subtract 7 and 12 hundredths from 9 and 92 hundredths, which gives me 2 and 80 hundredths. 9 and 92 hundredths is the number that we call the winner. It gets to determine the sign. In the original problem, that number was negative, which means this answer will be negative. And then when you write the answer, you don't have to keep that 0 on the end. So the answer is -2 8/10. All right, this is just an ordinary subtraction problem. We will go ahead and insert a 0 at the end of 5 and 9/10. 1 minus 0 is 1. I can't take 9 from 2, so I'm going to borrow 1 from here, make that a 5, make that a 12. 12 minus 9 is 3. 5 minus 5 is 0. And then just bring down the 5. So the answer, the difference, is 50 and 31 hundredths. Okay, here's one that you can try if you're feeling confident. 28 and no tenths, I'm putting that 0 there so that it has the same number of decimal places as the other number. I can't take 3 from 0, so I'm going to borrow 1 from the 8 and put that over here. So now 10 minus 3 is 7. 7 minus 3 is 4. Bring down the 2. The difference is 24 and 7/10. All right, subtract from, one of my favorite kinds of problems. So remember that when they use the word subtract from, that changes the order. So it's not going to be 19 minus 25 and 91 hundredths. It's going to be the other way around. We're inserting 2 zeros after the decimal point in the 19. And that one should be pretty simple. All right, now we're subtracting a negative from a negative. So this is the kind of problem that I always like to turn into add the opposite. Think of -5 and 4/10 minus 9 and 6/10. Think of that as -5 and 4/10 plus -9 and 6/10. I'm adding the opposite. And when you add negative numbers or two numbers with the same sign, you ignore the signs and you add. Okay. 5 and 4/10 plus 9 and 6/10 comes out to 15. That's something that you should check. Try that part on your own. And then because both of these numbers are negative, the answer is negative. When you add two negatives, you get a negative. And you know that I always like to relate things to money. So you can think of this as my checking account is overdrawn by $5.40. If I try to take out $9.60, now I'm going to be overdrawn by $15. All right, here's another one where you could pause the video and try this one. It's kind of similar to that last one. We're going to change that to add the opposite. So instead of subtracting -7 and 23 hundredths, I'm going to add +7 and 23 hundredths. So now I'm adding a negative and a positive. Ignore the signs and subtract. 7 and 23 hundredths minus 1 and 5 hundredths is 6 and 18 hundredths. And the winner gets to pick the sign. The winner is 7 and 23 hundredths. In the addition problem, that number is negative. I'm sorry, in the addition problem, that number is positive. So that's why the answer is positive. Okay. All right, so that brings us to estimating. So they suggest, and I think this is a good idea, that when you're adding or subtracting decimals, that you also try to estimate the answer to see if your answer is reasonable. And you can do that by rounding all of your decimals to the nearest whole number. So remember, we went over that in the last So 7 6/10 minus 2 1/10. I'm going to round 7 6/10 up to 8. I'm going to round 2 1/10 down to 2. So my estimate for this answer would be 8 minus 2, which is 6. When I do the exact answer, I get 5 5/10, which is reasonably close to 6. So that tells me that that's probably a good answer. All right, now we'll try the same thing with 23 8/10 plus 32 1/10. We'll round 23 8/10 up to 24. We'll round 32 1/10 down to 32. The exact answer is 55 9/10. The estimated answer is 56. So that's really close. I'm confident in that answer. All right, now we get into evaluating expressions with decimal replacement values. So they want me to evaluate x plus y if x is 5 5/10 and y is 2 8/10. So this is just a fancy way of asking you what is 5 5/10 plus 2 8/10. That comes out to 8 3/10. All right, simplifying expressions. One of my favorite expressions that I like to use, I should say favorite phrases that I like to use in teaching is think of a simpler, happier time. So imagine that these weren't decimals and this just said negative 4y plus 8 minus 20y plus 15. All right, we went over problems like that back in chapter 3. And one of the analogies that I like to use in my classes is apples and oranges. So anything that has a variable term, I call an apple. Anything that's a constant term, I call an orange. So we're going to put the apples with the apples, put the oranges with the oranges. So notice that they've just rearranged the order of the terms. And they've also changed all of the subtractions to add the opposite. So now that these two are parked next to each other, we'll just figure out what the new coefficient is going to be. It's going to be negative 4 3/10 plus negative 20 1/10. We're adding two negatives. So we ignore the signs and we add. 20 1/10 plus 4 3/10 is 24 4/10. But it does get a negative because those two are both negative. And then add these two, 7 8/10 plus 14 6/10 is 22 4/10. So the simplified expression is negative 24 4/10 y plus 22 4/10. And remember not to combine those two at the end. All right, that does not come out to negative 2y or anything. Those two just stay separate. All right, and that brings us to a little application problem. Find the total monthly cost of owning and operating a certain automobile given these expenses. The monthly car payment is $563.52. The monthly insurance is $52.68, and the average gas per month is $127.50. Notice the word total, which means add. So we're going to add these numbers together. And alongside of that, we're also going to do the estimate so that we can determine if our answer is reasonable. So if you round these, they're rounding these to the nearest, well, they're not kind of, they rounded the first one to the nearest 100, they rounded this one to the nearest 10, and they rounded that one to the nearest 100. So the advantage of doing it that way is it makes the numbers, the rounded numbers super easy to add. Those are going to add up to $750. Anytime that you have to do this in homework, it will give you guidance on how to round the numbers if they want you to do an estimate. Okay. All right, so the rounded numbers add up to $750. if the exact numbers add up to $743.70. Those two are close together, so that seems like a reasonable answer. All right, here's one more application problem. The bar graph shows the current average height for adults in various countries. How much greater is the average height in the Netherlands than the average height in Czechoslovakia? So I look at the bar graph and I see that the average height in the Netherlands is 72 6/10 inches. The average height in Czechoslovakia is 70 8/10 inches. And when they say how much greater, that's asking me to find the difference. So this is a subtraction problem. And while we're figuring out the exact answer, we'll also do the estimated answer. So those two numbers round to 73 and 71. 73 minus 71 is 2. The exact answer is 1 8/10. I'm sorry, 1 8/10. So that is a reasonable answer. The average height in the Netherlands is 1 8/10 inches greater than the average height in Czechoslovakia. And that does it for section 5.2.